Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Dr. Alan Fromhertz. I direct the Middle East Studies Center at Georgia State University, and it is my honor to introduce you to Andrea Stumpf, who will be speaking today on Sayyida Salme, the Princess of Oman and Zanzibar. Andrea Emily Stumpf is an American-trained international lawyer and award-winning author. She worked in several private law firms and companies and then transitioned to the World Bank's legal department before striking out on her own. She specializes in structuring international partnerships and in supporting partnership clients around the world. Several years ago, she also embarked on another project, translating her great-great-grandmother's writings from the 19th century. As a descendant of Sayyida Salme or Emily Ruete, Andrea has felt a special responsibility for ensuring that her ancestor's voice is accurately represented. Andrea is excited to make Sayyida Salme's inspiring story from Zanzibar to Germany and her remarkable insights of East and West newly available today. Join me in welcoming Andrea Stumpf.
Thank you so much. I am so happy to be with you today, and my thanks to Alan and GSU and to Warsan and the University of Michigan for the chance to join in with you today. Thank you to all of you for being here. And I especially enjoyed the sneak preview last week with Professor Zweiri. So I'm happy to kind of continue to share with you from history, from the Middle East. Our topic today is Sayyida Salme. I have a particular interest in her because she is my great-great-grandmother. But I think you'll also find her interesting, and not just historically, but also for today. So I'm going to keep fairly close to my script because I don't want to run off track. There's so much I could say, and I really want to have plenty of time for the discussion afterwards. So that's always the best part. So let me get started. Let history surprise you. Let her story inspire you. Let her authentic voice speak to you. I like to start with my tagline. It's a little catchy, but also it reflects what we'll cover today. First, I'm going to share with you some about the time, the context in which Sayyida Salme grew up. And then I'll introduce her to you and share some about her life. And finally, I'll talk about the books, her writing, and my translations. I can, of course, only scratch the surface today, and I'll be moving pretty fast, about half an hour of slides, but that way we'll have more chance to discuss afterwards. So, the time. This was the age of the dhows. And what do I mean by that? Well, we're back in the middle of the 19th century, at a time when these great sailing ships still plied the Indian Ocean. This is in large part what made Oman, which has such a small population, a small place, into a thriving country with outsized influence. And because I like to connect the dots, do any of you remember Professor Zweiri's comment from last week saying that Oman is the largest country state is the longest country state in the Gulf with the longest history and lots of statehood experience? So that is true. And in fact, it's not just the country state of Oman, but it's the royal family. The family that is in power now, the Al Busaid family. And to put it in perspective, my mother is Sultan Haytham's cousin on the extended family tree. That family has been reigning Oman all the way back to 1744. So guess what? That means the Omani Sultanate is even older than the American Republic. I'm not a monarchist, and of course we are talking about a population of 3 million versus 300 million, but to Professor Zweiri's point about democracy and how Sultan Qaboos managed the Arab uprising, they are apparently doing something right. So how did it happen? What made Oman great? Well, lots of factors, but we can start with the wind, the monsoon winds. So if you look at the two blue arrows, it's actually pretty cool. Half of the year, the winds blow in one direction, and then half of the year they flip and they blow in the other direction. So coming from the hot and the moist African continent headed north and east, and then they go back down, cold and dry off of the Himalayas, south and west. So if you started your ship in Muscat, which is the tip of the Arabian Peninsula there, and the winds would take you all the way down to Zanzibar along the east coast of Africa, and then you unload your cargo and reload, and maybe you take a couple of months to sell and to buy, and then you head back up. And you're headed first to Bombay in India, and then over to Muscat. And this would go on year after year, and it became known as the Trade Triangle. It's pretty climate friendly. And it might not have been so obvious at first, but now you can see the connection between Oman and Zanzibar. So geography is destiny, as they say. Zanzibar was a pretty attractive place to be. It was better than the desert interior. So the Omanis, led by the great Sultan Said bin Sultan, and he reigned from 1806 to 1856. And Alan knows a lot about him and has written about him, and that's how I met Alan. Anyhow, if you look to the left of the slide here, Said systematically got control of the whole east coast of Africa down to Zanzibar, and then actually made Zanzibar the capital of Oman. And under his leadership, then, this crucial corner of the trade triangle became a nexus for all things going in and out of East Africa. So it's a pretty busy slide, but that included the European colonial powers who were super interested in that part of the world at that time. And of course, then, it was mostly an extractive exercise. So on the island itself, Said built up the worldwide monopoly of cloves, which were very popular at the time. I don't know if anyone eats cloves now. A lot was also, though, being pulled out of the interior. Like, it was definitely not a good time to be an elephant, with huge amounts of ivory being exported. This was before plastics. And of course, very tragically, people, which is to say slaves. So Zanzibar was a very hierarchical society. Everybody had their tiered place, from royalty to slavery. There were even tiers within the tiers. So the eunuchs had their place. The whiter sarari, or the concubines, were ranked above the blacker ones. And more plantation slaves were coming in, and they were at the bottom. So by the 1860s or so, slaves made up more than 2/3 of the Zanzibari population. So let's dwell on the topic of slavery just a moment more. I'm not a scholar, so some of you may know this history far better than I do. Although here in the United States, we mostly learn about West Africa and not East Africa. I don't have good numbers, but the slave trade in both was horrific. And Zanzibar had a very central role in the slave trade on the eastern side. And many of the slave expeditions both began and ended in Zanzibar. The royal family grew up with slaves. In fact, Sayyida Salme had them as of birth, her own coterie of slaves. The Sultan and many others profited from the slave trade. Much of the island's prosperity during this time was tied to slaves, not only as exports to other parts of the world, but also as slave imports for their agricultural production, for their clove production, so for agriculture. And then the clove exports, of course, brought further profits. So all in all, this was a very, I would call it a very frenzied period when the market just grew and grew hand over fist. So you haven't met Sayyida Salme yet, that's coming soon. But as you get to know the story, I'm going to give you 3 things to think about, kind of teasers, and we can discuss them more later. So Sayyida Salme was both a product of slavery and an owner of slaves. She was also both a subject and an object of racism. So she was racist herself, and then she was treated with racism later in life. But at the time, historically, at her time, she was not criticized for being racist. That's the criticism we tend to give today. At the time, the real problem was her conversion from Islam to Christianity, and she had to self-exile as an apostate and infidel. So just a little bit more before we get to her. I've given you a pretty complete picture here so far, but maybe you have noticed something. I did leave out something important. You've only heard the father's side. And by the way, giving credit where it's due, these maps are from my son, Max, in the books. But the father's side is all that you're going to get from the official record. And Omani rule is even to this day succession only through the male members of the family. So of course, the obvious question is, what about Sayyida Salme's mother? So I'm glad you asked, because that's an important story as well. Sayyida Salme's mother, Jilfidan, was Circassian. I don't know if anyone has heard of Circassia or knew where Circassia is, or more accurately, where it used to be. It was never a country, but it was a region, a people, a culture, a language. Here in the highlands northeast of the Black Sea, catty-corner to Ukraine, and also next to Russia. And that is another tragic story. We don't know much about Jilfidan, just what Sayyida Salme writes. But Turkish mercenaries came through, killed her parents, rode off with her 2 siblings, never to be seen again. And then she was, at the age of 5 or 6, sold into slavery. And that is how she ended up in Zanzibar at an unusually young age as part of the harem. She grew into basically becoming one of the sarari, which is the concubines, what they called the secondary wives in the Sultan's harem. In fact, she was so young that we think she was probably gifted to the Sultan and then essentially was raised in the harem household. What you should know is that Russia wanted access to the sea. And literally over 100 years, from 1763 to 1864, Russia systematically and brutally decimated the Circassians. It is said that 90% of the population either fled or died. And this is relevant history for anyone who might think that the present war in Ukraine is just one-off. Russia has been empire building by running roughshod over its neighbors for centuries. It might seem odd that a kindergarten-age Jilfidan would have had any value to be sold, but maybe you've heard of the Circassian beauties. Here they are. And it was a thing. And part of their value was in their race, meaning the purest of the Caucasian race. Circassia is in the Caucasus, the whitest, the most elevated race of the scientific scale of races. And how convenient that right at this moment, Russian aggression was flooding the market with these white women on sale, including Jilfidan. Now, there's one more thing that bears mentioning before I leave this slide, and if you think about it, the East African ravagement that I was just describing a couple of slides ago was happening at the same time that Circassia was being ravaged. These were contemporaneous events, and it's interesting what history we are taught and what we are not taught. All right, time to keep moving on to part 2, her life. And here she is, Sayyida Salme, Princess Salme herself. And that's me at the bottom, right at the bottom of the line, 4 generations later. As I said, she is my great-great-grandmother. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the expression on the spindle side. It's a very 19th century expression, as opposed to the spear side. Well, I'm on the spindle side, which is to say that my connection is all through the women, and it's as real as it can be. So here she is in her traditional attire. in Hamburg in 1868, just after she had arrived in Germany. Huh? You might be asking yourself, how did this Omani Zanzibari princess end up in Germany? Well, here's the story. Let's start with the fact that she was born in Zanzibar in 1844, and that was surely a joyous occasion, although frankly, it had happened probably about 100 other times as well, and that is no exaggeration. With 75 Sarari in the harem, the number is maybe not too surprising. 36 children, half siblings of Sayyida Salme, were still living when Said died in 1856. 3 years later, though, Sayyida Salme's mother also died in a terrible cholera wave on the island. So even with so much family around her, she was pretty much on her own by the age of 15. She did have a happy childhood, and her writing describes that in great, really ethnographic detail. So I will note only 3 things here. First, the children of the Sultan, even the ones from the Sarari, from the concubines, were considered royalty. And that is very different from the American way, where a child of a master and a slave was still a slave. But not here, not the Arab way, not in the harem style of the Arab tradition. Second, I mentioned that her mother had entered the harem at quite a young age, and that was young enough for her to sit with the royal siblings in their school classes and learn how to read. And this was not at all the norm for Sarari. So Sayyida Salme grew up with a literate mom. And third, even more unusual, Sayyida Salme, who was clearly bright and self-confident and perhaps a little too headstrong for her own good, she secretly taught herself to write. Boys were taught to write, but not the girls. It was taboo for the girls. So can you picture it? She used the Quran, which they had been reciting with their teacher, and she copied the script on the shoulder blade of a camel. That is how she learned. And of course, she got into trouble when people found out. But what are you going to do? Once you learn it, you can't unlearn it. And that was her literary beginning. And then came tenuous times. You can read about them in the memoirs. And one thing led to another. And then she met a German merchant by the name of Heinrich Ruete. So yes, as unthinkable as it might seem, at the time, it was truly unthinkable, they fell in love. And by the time she started showing in August of 1866, there was no denying it. So it really was time to go. And quite incredibly, she fled the island on a British sailing ship, the High Flyer, and then waited for Heinrich, had her child 4 months later, and then as soon as he arrived, a crazy 9 months later, she became Christian and was baptized Emily. And then immediately after that, she was married Ruete. And immediately after that, they took off by sea and trained through France to Hamburg in northern Germany. And I am sorry to mention that her infant son, the reason that she had to flee, died along the way between Lyon and Paris. And for all the pages and pages that she wrote, she never once wrote about that. Not even in the family did we know what had happened. I mean, lots of speculation, but no one knew what really happened until documents were found in the late 90s, which is to say the 1990s. Okay, I'll take a few minutes to say a few words about the books. I've now published 5 books in 5 years, professional ones as well, and I'm working on a 6th one now. And I admit I am totally bitten by the self-publishing bug, and I'm happy to proselytize anyone on that score if you're interested. Anyhow, once she got to Germany, she was no longer Sayyida Salme, but Emily Ruete. And about 20 years later, in 1886, Emily Ruete became the first Arab woman ever to publish a book. And I know I can't completely prove it. I know historians are pretty careful that way. Sorry, historians. Sorry, that was a little Freudian. No, please. but I will keep saying it until someone shows me someone earlier. And yet it's not too surprising considering her history. So Arab women were barely taught to read, much less write, and her case really is quite exceptional. And get this, having grown up with native Arabic, and Swahili, she wrote and published in German. The memoirs were very popular when it came out. People in the Occident, meaning the West, were very curious about the Orient in a voyeuristic kind of way, especially about this exotic princess and harem life. So here's my version that I put out a couple of years ago, my English translation, and the people here in the room are able to take a look at the copies. I add a few brief essays and a bunch of photos to provide context. Now, mine is not, oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. Mine is not the first English translation, and you may ask why in the world I felt that the world needed another one. It's primarily because the first two from 1888 and 1907 were not as accurate as they should be. And one in particular, the 1907 one from Lionel Strachey, is also a complete distortion. So I decided I really needed to rescue her voice. And while I was at it, I thought I would update her text for a 21st century audience and make it widely available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook. So if you want a copy, then please look for mine, because believe me, there is no shortage of reprints out there. It's so easy to just reprint the text and plop a cover on it, and even covers with her name misspelled and photos that have nothing to do with anything. And virtually all of them are reprinting that really awful Strachey translation. So for the scholars of you out there, here's what I'd like to say. If you are looking at an original source, ask yourself, is this a translation? For older books especially, is this translation any good? For some translations, you need to ask, has it been abridged or censored? I don't read Arabic, but I'm pretty sure that the Arabic, at least some of the Arabic translations, there's several of the memoirs censored out, some of the more sensitive parts. As it is, most of the memoirs reprints that I just show you give no indication that they are translations, much less make any effort to stay true to the original. Scholars end up quoting from the mangled translation, and they don't even realize it. That is not all, though. There's a second book. This was from a manuscript that was left behind that her children found only after her death. She called it Briefe nach der Heimat, which I translate letters to the homeland. And it describes her early years in Germany, which were really pretty awful, one excruciating episode after another. And that was surely a shock for her children to read. But for us, it is also fascinating because the letters are somehow uncannily relevant for the kinds of issues that we are facing today. Things like immigration, women's rights and agency, capitalism, authenticity, and much more. And this is my version that I published last year. I'm working on a third one now that adds a couple of shorter translations and a few more essays and lots more photos. And that third one is now going to be the Centennial Collection, because something I haven't even mentioned yet, this year is 100 years since Sayyida Salme died. So I am under the gun, because if I don't get this out by the end of the year, I can't really call it the Centennial Collection. So I'm making progress. So there you have it. Two worlds, East and West, two names, Sayyida Salme and Emily Ruete, and two books, the memoirs, mostly about Zanzibar, and the letters, mostly about her life in Europe, in Germany afterwards. An extraordinary woman in an extraordinary time, and the best part of it is that it's not just history. The life she lived and what she writes, her observations and insights from her East-West lens are still so relevant today. And so much so that I have a whole blog devoted to sharing examples. It's called Sayyida Salme Speaks, And every month I give you a short essay and a quote from her writings to make you think about topics for today. You can find my latest one, The Race We Are In, if you go to my website www.sayyidasalme.com. So if I were to sum it up, this is not some sort of distant fairy tale or curio from the past. Sayyida Salme's story is extraordinary, but it is also ordinary in the millions of tales of resilience across borders and barriers, systems and institutions, time and generations, across history and humanity. So it has been such a pleasure to share, and I really look forward to hearing from you all now. Thank you. Many thanks. Herzlichen Dank. Shukran jalizan. Asante sana. And over to you.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much, Shukran jazilan. Yes, very good. Thank you, Andrea. Excellent. And I just wanted to echo again your thanks to University of Michigan for co-sponsoring this event. And also Warsan, who is representing Michigan right now. She is handling the Zoom and the Q&A on Zoom. Hello, Warsan, welcome. Hi. And I wanted to see if it's okay, Warsan, should we see if there's somebody in the room first who has a question?
No, we don't have any questions right now from the chat.
Zoom yet? Okay. If you have a question for Andrea and you are on chat, please go ahead and send that using the chat feature if you're on Zoom right now. Are there any questions from the audience to begin with? Oh, sure. Yeah. Go ahead, Kelly. Yeah.
Go ahead, Kelly. Did you grow growing up this with your ancestors? Was this something that sparked your interest later on to do your research about? Or how did this come up?
And we'll have
So,
Andrea repeat
yeah.
the question from the room. Yeah.
I'm actually feeling a little erratic, like not where to, I don't really know where to put my eyes. I have people in the room, I've got the screen and I've got the
This
other
is
screen.
the hybrid way.
I'm not doing a very good job of that. So
Yeah.
for those of you online, I'm not looking at you as much as I could, but to repeat the question, I guess just to say it in brief, what got me into this, was I aware of Sayyida Salme growing up? To what extent was that part of kind of the upbringing, or what got me maybe more interested than to eventually do the translations? So I think to put it in perspective, I certainly had some awareness that I was related to a princess, but for a long time wasn't really kind of specifically knowledgeable about it. The seminal translation in English that came out later, there is one from 1993. I didn't really have the English translation to read. The German was out there. I could have read that, but I didn't make it my business very much growing up as a child. It's certainly not something where I was kind of raised like I'm part of the royal family. In fact, we were essentially thrown out of the royal family when she got basically converted. And even though, you know, there's a known connection, I could never say that I'm part of the Al-Busaidi family in the royal family sense. But the interesting thing for us is that in some ways we have gotten to know Sayyida Salme the same way that any of you would get to know her, by reaching back into the history and also directly into her writings. And that's particularly true in my branch of the family. So I'm related to Rosa, who is the youngest daughter. She ended up staying in Germany. Other parts of the family moved to the United States or to England and then the US. So my branch of the family stayed in Germany. And, you know, the 20th century history in Germany was a lot of upheaval. And especially in World War II, it's definitely not a time to talk about your Arabian ancestry. In addition to which, like in terms of keeping any documents or materials, Rosa had her house was in Jena, which is in Eastern Germany. So when World War II ended, that ended up in Russian occupation. She was able to come to the West because she had family members that could vouch for her to leave the Russian occupied zone. But that house was left behind with everything in it. So we've had very little that we then still had within the family as kind of keepsakes from that time. And then added to that, Rosa and her two daughters, so my grandmother and her sister, all died within a year and a half of each other in 47, 48. So we lost two generations when my mother was just 11. And so that history also didn't transmit orally to us. So I'm giving quite a long answer, but essentially it was my father, so not even directly related, who suggested, let's go to Zanzibar, which we did in 98, had an amazing experience, and that kind of kindled an interest. And honestly, very ambitiously, I thought, oh, I'd like to get close to my ancestor. Let me just translate her words and not just get to know her, but get to know her words, like really study them. And I did a third of the translation back in 2001. But then I got really busy, started a new job, had a child, you know how things go. And it wasn't until the pandemic, and I'm sure we all have some silver linings from the pandemic, this was one of mine, that I said, okay, I should just really go back to this. And I pulled up that 1/3 translated portion and just kept going. And I guess one book after another, I'm much deeper into it now and really grateful that I have the space to do that later in my career, you know, that I've actually been able to carve out some time for this. So I'd like to think of myself a bit as a bridge to getting to know her the same way that I have been able to get to know her. And when you go to my blog, you'll see that I'm not interested in just describing her. I really want her words to speak for themselves. And I always quote from her. So I always pull actual language that she wrote in my translation, in my translated English, and make that a part of my description of why she's relevant for today. Because her words in and of themselves are still so present. It's such a gift to us in a way, and so meaningful if we really think about it all these generations later.
And we're grateful for your intervention as scholars and as people interested in this part of the world.
So you can actually read the right words,
yes,
right?
very great.
Get the right translation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Warsan, do we have a question online?
Yes, we have a lot of questions online, actually. I'll start with the first one.
Shorter answers. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Yeah, we have a question from Halima. She asked, given that slavery was an integral part to the economic and social structures in Zanzibar, how does your translation differ from the original English translation? Specifically, how does Emily Ruete's narration change or offer new insights in this more authentic version?
Oh, that's such a good question. I really appreciate it because it lets me unpack a number of different things. So thank you, Halima. First of all, I will say that as I translated the memoirs, the hardest chapter to translate was the chapter on slavery, because it is a difficult subject. And I offer you an authentic translation, so I wasn't going to somehow self-censor or decide that some things are better left unsaid. No, so it is all there. She also makes a handful of racist statements. It's not really that many, but they're really awkward to read today because we read them in a way that I think historically they would have not sensed the racism that we feel today, but they're very jarring, even if it's just a single statement. So there's some of those. So those were all difficult to translate, but they're there. So I was really committed to translating what she wrote. But there is a little nuance in there, and particularly I like that you asked, how did it maybe change? We not only have her published 1886 version, but we also have a marked copy of the book, hand marked by her, and also some help from her daughter Rosa, where she clearly, after having published, went back and rethought a few things. Probably she'd gotten some feedback and maybe some criticism. And so these markings are kind of updates, and they were thinking about republishing. It never did get republished, but she ended up revising things. And the one chapter that she revised the most was the slavery chapter. So she took out a lot of sections in that slavery chapter that she had in the original. So for example, quotes from other people. And I can't tell you why she thought better of it, but I felt pretty committed to allowing her later version to be the current version, quote unquote, the republished version, because I wanted to give credence to her second thoughts or her better wisdom or her revised approach. So what you have in the versions that I've published incorporates those edits from that marked copy. And the marked copy sits in Leiden, in the Leiden universities, where there's a large collection of materials from the family, also from her son. So in that sense, I think it was a very present topic for her in this, in the way that she knew she had to write about it. She devoted an entire chapter to it. She was not a shrinking violet, so she said what she thought, and she knew it would be controversial, but it's one of the things I like about her is that she put her voice out there. And she says in her afterword, in the English translation, there was an afterword added. She said that was her mission. That was her whole raison d'etre for doing this, is to speak authentically. And she, I think, grappled with the topic quite a bit. But if we think about it too, she had a very particular viewpoint. I mean, if you imagine that from the day she was born, she had slaves around her taking care of her as royalty, and she inherited several hundred slaves when she inherited plantations after her father died. I mean, it was just the fabric of her existence in a way that might have given her a certain image of what slavery is, particularly the, let me say, Arab version of slavery. Slavery is different, with a lot of stratification and different kinds of relationships than, say, the American plantation slaves. And that's all worth trying to understand and study. She has been called an apologist for slavery, and I think if you read it a certain way, you will conclude that she was maybe even defending slavery. But I take it somewhat differently, which is to say that she was also a, let's call it an indigenous voice, a local voice, who was not just concerned about slavery, but all of society. And I comment on this in one of the essays at the back of the memoirs, which I call On Controversy. She was very concerned that if you stop slavery abruptly from one day to the next, and you don't do anything to transition the slaves back into society or to help the slaveholding class figure out how to manage from day one to the next, that it would be essentially disastrous for the community. And you can see there is a direct correlation, I think, between slavery having been stopped over time, particularly through British pressure, and Zanzibar's decline over time, and essentially British control by the end of the 19th century. This is not to justify slavery in any way, but just to say the story is more complex, and what you get from her is an indigenous viewpoint that is concerned about all of society, a whole of society view, not just managing slaves per se and then thinking you're done with it. And if I may be so bold to also say, you know, the US was a slave society, certainly before the Civil War. And I think we are still dealing with its after effects today. And that's in part because there was not, we were not able to fully manage the transition. So the things that she was worried about, I think some of those after effects, aftershocks, are things that are still lingering with us. So I would think she has a point of view that's at least thinking about in the context of the whole. So that may be more than the question that you asked, Halima. I know there are other questions, but I hope that was at least answered what you were asking. Warsan, maybe we move to the next question?
Or should we
Oh,
give
sure.
Jack a chance?
Sure, yeah.
Or did you want?
I was interested in your letters to the homeland. Was there a particular letter that struck you, that spoke to you in a different way from the other letters that you had the opportunity to read?
So Jack was just asking in letters to the homeland whether there was a particular letter that struck me relative to the others that are in the book. So the first thing to say is there are actually no letters. She called it letters to the homeland, and perhaps they were based on letters that she had written, or I think maybe even it was a kind of rhetorical device to essentially write to someone. She's clearly has someone in mind as she's writing the letters, but the manuscript itself is basically 3 notebooks that are handwriting from like beginning to end and don't even really have chapters or indentations. It's just one flow. And it has a huge emotional effect because these are really emotional passages that she's putting down. And as it just continues, you know, there's a little bit of breaks in terms of topics, but it's not like she has to and from and dated and, you know, some kinds of letters. In fact, as far as I know, there are no historical letters. There was a lot of correspondence between her and her family. So
In Zanzibar, she
yes,
sent letters
exactly.
to Zanzibar.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And they would send them back. And she has a very funny description because most of the people who were sending letters back could not read or write. So they had to rely on their slaves to help with that, or their scribes. In any case, is there a letter that stands out? I would say a letter so much, but I didn't dwell on this, but I didn't even share this in the slide presentation. Part of what made her time in Germany so difficult is that she lost her husband after 3 years. So you have to imagine that she was in this new country, new environment, had 3 children, and suddenly her husband's gone, and he's her bridge to everything. So she's a widow and trying to raise her children. So her description of her husband's passing and also descriptions of, you know, the challenges she had after that are really raw. And it's actually very special that we have this account, which was not edited, unlike the memoirs, for publication, and is in some ways repetitious, because that's how life is, right? We have the same issues over and over again, or the same questions. So you really get a feeling of what that existence was like, what that time was. But I'll also answer your question by saying I did the audiobook for it. So I have, oh, and I should say, I just literally yesterday loaded the audiobook for the letter. So it took me many months to do. I'm the narrator, so I translate my voice, hers into mine, and then I speak it, which has been very cool. I was exhausted after the audio session for the description of her husband's death, because it is such an emotional account. And I hope I was able to reflect that in the audiobook as well. All right.
Good. Warsan, do you have another question online?
Yes, we have a lot of questions online. So the next one we have is from Zakaria. He asks, does not speaking Arabic or Swahili pose obstacles to this scholarship?
Thank you, Zakaria. I can be a little shorter to answer this one. Absolutely. I mean, I wish I spoke Arabic. I would love to speak Swahili. It was not only difficult when I had to pretend that I knew Swahili in the audiobook when I was narrating it, but I do think that if I had Arabic available or Swahili, I would have been able to access other documents more readily and get other perspectives, more of the context. So I do miss that, and I do rely on scholars to, you know, fill in some of those pieces and create some of those connections. As far as the translation itself, I would say it was not an issue because she wrote in German. I was born in Germany. I grew up speaking German. I also have my dear mother as a collaborator here. So between her and me, we have double and triple and quadruple checked, you know, every word to try to see, are we saying it the right way? Are we translating it with the meaning that she intended? So that piece of it was more straightforward. But contextually, you know, even her son had a lot of books that he collected and donated to the library to Leiden. There's some, you know, very important records and accounts that would certainly fill in some of the gaps. So for those of you who do speak Arabic and Swahili, may I encourage you to, you know, contribute to the scholarship around this. That would be wonderful. Thanks.
Is there a question in the room?
No, go ahead. Oh, there is actually, yes.
Kind of question the topic of slavery then overseas versus slavery here in the States. And you mentioned like the transition period, you know, and I guess that's like, you know, part of like, what was it called? Like the Reconstruction era or something like that. Being like one of the reasons why everything was like really tumultuous. But do you think that also possibly it matters, like, who, you know, is actually involved in slavery versus how you contribute to, you know, people getting out of it? Like, do you think it matters, like, you know, who's actually doing it?
Yeah, okay, so the question was, if I can try to summarize it, thinking about transition period from slavery to a non-slavery environment, in the sense of, as I was describing it, that it can be a very traumatic experience for society, can be very tumultuous, and we certainly had the Reconstruction period here in the United States after the post-Civil War period, the Jim Crow period, essentially coming out of that. And so the question was, does it make a difference as to who's involved in the slavery in terms of how that can transition outward? Did I say that in a good way? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like who's involved makes a very big difference, and also what culture is brought into the relationships that constituted slavery. So as I mentioned, the very fact that, you know, under Arab tradition, particularly in the harem environment, the nature of slavery had a lot more nuance to it than what we traditionally think of in terms of plantation slaves in the United States. And I would explain that partly by saying there were kind of different classes of slaves. I mean, the Sarari were slaves. They were secondary wives, but they were slaves. And if you read in the memoirs description, you can see how Sayyida Salme's mother has to work. She's basically told, go here, or, you know, ask, can you work for us? But she's a slave. She's working, even though she was a Sarari and had a role as a concubine as well. But then there's the eunuchs. We don't talk about eunuchs nowadays. I mean, I usually don't hear anyone talk about them, but I mean, what a kind of tragic, but also like fascinating category of slavery. The eunuchs were super powerful in the harem household. They were kind of at the top tier in some ways. They were very close to the Sultan. They were the guards. They were respected. They were given huge amounts of responsibility. They were trusted. So they were slaves, but with a very different kind of profile and different cultural understanding of what that kind of slavery meant. And then you had the plantation slaves, and I think probably much like in the United States, many plantation slaves obviously had a very difficult time to even get to that stage of, you know, being sold at auction and then doing the work, but many died doing the work. So I think it was, you know, you had these many different categories of slavery, but particularly in the harem household, you can see how these interdependent relationships also factor into this. I'll just say one more thing. If you look at the history, it's very striking to me that Sayyida Salme, who started out in royalty, and her mother in slavery, and then you kind of look what happened to the rest of their lives. Sayyida Salme basically went from royalty to poverty. She really was impoverished during many of those years in Germany because she chose freedom, and she ended up marrying her husband and left, you know, exiled herself. Her mother, on the other hand, started in slavery and had a very comfortable and secure life until the very end. She actually gained her freedom under Arab convention when the Sultan died, and her daughter inherited plantations that were to her benefit. So, you know, just that little trajectory makes you think, wow, what's going on here? And transitioning out of those different environments, the US environment and an Arab slave context, probably would have some very different dynamics going on because the starting point is already so different.
Thank you. Did you already ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is she just addressing like the harem slavery, or is she addressing chattel slavery in her, right?
You said chattel.
Chattel slavery, right. Yeah, the question was whether in the writing she's addressing harem slavery or chattel slavery. She doesn't make much of a distinction. She does acknowledge that the process of getting slaves to auction, so basically these slave caravans And some of you may know the statistics better than I do. I mean, obviously, a huge percentage of lives were lost just in the journey. And I think lots of lives were lost in actually collecting the slaves. I mean, it's kind of incredible. It was this huge network of Africans against Africans. It was almost like if you weren't powerful enough to get slaves, you would probably end up slaves. Like if your village wasn't on the upper hand, you would probably end up on the lower. I mean, it was just like warfare, internal warfare, when whole villages and regions were depleted of people. So massive loss of life to even get to the point of slavery. So that she clearly acknowledges that that is not acceptable and totally tragic. But as to slavery generally and how it should be, what the transition should be, she's not really making those kinds of distinctions. Those are kind of left for us to think about with our historical perspective and appreciation of the differences. In fact, she doesn't really describe the eunuchs as slaves or her mother as slaves. I think there's some appreciation of it, but it's not quite the same. And just a thought I would add now is that her lens is more about, not so much about freedom, because I think there was real value in having sort of the welfare state of the harem household, so that even servants and slaves were taken care of, was almost more important than concepts of freedom that we think about today. So her lens was more of a racism lens. And this idea that Blacks were inferior, the Africans was a primitive culture, that was really the racism of the time. And so the lens, the color lens, colored it much more than really gradations of freedom. That's just a thought.
Thank you. Waisan, do you have maybe one more question for us online?
Yes, we have a question from Justine. They asked, how did you find out you're related to her? Was her name always mentioned in your upbringing?
Yeah, actually, it's a nice question because it lets me emphasize my middle name. So I'm Andrea Emily Stumpf. And so the Emily does come directly from Emily Ruete. And my mother's name is Ursula Emily Stumpf. So she has the Emily. Her mother's name was Emily. So we have lots of Emilys. What was actually pretty special for me is that when I had my child, I was able to kind of reach back even further in history and not use the name Emily, but my son's middle name is Salme. So I guess part of the limitation is that having been born in Germany and my mother and grandmother, Germany has restrictions, or at least used to have restrictions on first names. I don't even know if Salme would have been approved, but for me, it was no problem to give my son the name Salme, which I think he appreciates. It's also, perhaps you've noticed that when I refer to her as Sayyida Salme. I don't usually refer to her as Emily Ruete. And I mentioned that in the foreword to the letters. It's actually quite intentional. I do want to touch base, so to speak, with her in terms of her original self. I consider Emily Ruete, as much as she adopted that name and became Emily Ruete, living in Germany, I see some coercion in that name. The fact that she had to convert to Christianity to marry her husband, and that then, of course, caused the need to escape the island and essentially precluded her ability to reconcile with her family over time, is to me one, clear lack of choice that she had at the time. And so I look at Emily Ruete a little skeptically in terms of names. I'm not sure she would have agreed, but my comfort zone is in Sayyida Salme in referring to her that way. Do we have time for maybe one more question, or?
Sure, yes. We're not at noon yet.
Question on Zoom, if there's none in the room.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
So I think we're good. Thank you so much, Waisan.
Oh, I was gonna say we have one question on Zoom, if that's okay to answer.
Yeah,
Sure.
please. Yep.
Yeah. So Sayed Atif said, Thank you for your presentation. My question is, how well did Sayyida Salme integrate into Western society, and did she experience any racism due to her background?
Yeah, another great question. Thank you, Saeed. So I would,
He's one of my star students.
oh, wonderful. Okay. Then I need to come up with a star answer.
Oh,
Let's
it's
see.
okay.
So I would say, especially if you read the letters, you get a very clear appreciation for how challenging it was for her to kind of adapt to Western society. And today we're so homogenized, you know, through social media and ability to travel, that it's almost hard to imagine how very, very different it was. And also that she was so isolated. It's not like there were a bunch of other exotic Arab women, much less princesses out there. So it was truly, she was a spectacle, you know, and made to feel that all the time. So it was very, very, very challenging. So I think against that backdrop, it's amazing how well she adapted and how functional she became, both with the language and raising her children and navigating her space. Women back then also had relatively like no agency as far as finances. She had to have financial guardians. That also caused huge issues for her that you can read about. And yeah, so I think on the one hand, she did an amazing job of it. On the other hand, I think you can also tell by looking at her overall life that she was never fully comfortable, that if she was in Zanzibar, she was kind of forced into one paradigm. And then when she was in Germany, she was forced into the other paradigm. And as those of you who have multiple country backgrounds or geographies in your lives, multiple attachments, you know that it's not really either or. When you're in one setting, you feel more like the other. When you're in the other setting, you know, it's an amalgamation in your own self. And for her too, she was both Arab. She was proud of that all her life. And she didn't want to resist that at the same time that she became very Westernized. So she integrated it in herself, but her settings didn't allow her much of that integration. And so part of her story is that after her second trip to Zanzibar in 1888, she was really done with Germany, and like her children were older and she didn't need to be there anymore. And she was totally done with Zanzibar. I mean, neither country had done her right. And she ended up moving to Jaffa and then Beirut. And she spent more than 20 years, almost a third of her life, living in the Middle East, in greater Syria at the time. And I just was doing a little research on that period. I mean, what a flourishing time for Beirut. You know, she was in that, it was an amazing cosmopolitan city. And she describes, you know, Alexandria and Cairo as being these great cosmopolitan cities. So I feel like Beirut at the time was like the new Constantinople, you know, another great cosmopolitan city. So it's telling that she spent such a big chunk of her life in a setting that was neither Germany nor Zanzibar, but allowed her to be both Eastern and Western. So I think that was where she really thrived. And only in the last decade of her life did she go back to Germany. She was older, you know, 70 years old, and also World War I and everything that was happening, the Great Famine in Syria in 1915, you know, is really good that she was able to leave that area and then be with family after that. But just in a very interesting way, did she adapt? I mean, yes, she adapted, but I think intrinsically she ended up being both, and never gave up her Arab and also became Western at the same time. Yep.
Excellent questions, everybody. And just please join me in thanking Andrea one more time. Thank you so much.
I thank you all. Thank you.
And thank you, Warsan. Should we end the recording?
I would just say very quickly, if any of you are interested in my blog, you can go to the website and sign up for my newsletter there, or maybe
And here are the beautiful books.
yeah. And watch out for the third one, because that centennial compilation, it'll be a collection, which is the third book, and then I'll be doing a compilation that puts all three together. So that'll come out in the next month or so.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.